So I'd like to introduce Ewelina Ochab, who is originally from Poland, studied in Germany, now lives in the United Kingdom, and is almost finished with her PhD at the University of Kent in Canterbury. She's a legal researcher, human rights advocate, and author of the book, Never Again, Legal Responses to a Broken Promise in the Middle East, which has to do with genocide, and she'll talk about that. She works on the topic of persecution of minorities around the world with main projects including Daesh genocide in Syria and Iraq, Boko Haram, atrocities in West Africa, and the situation of religious minorities in South Asia. She's written over 30 UN reports, including Universal Periodic Review reports, and has made oral and written submissions at the Human Rights Council sessions and the UN Forum on Minority Issues. And as I said, she's currently working on her PhD in International Law, Human Rights, and Medical Ethics, all tied together. We're really honored to have her today. When I grow up, I want to be like her because she spends her life on behalf of others. And I think that's one of the best things a person can do, is to really invest in speaking up for those who cannot speak up for themselves. So Ewelina, would you come and speak to us?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I have to say that I spent some time with Todd and Gina, and I'm very impressed with the work that the center does. The center is not my competition. We do totally different things. The center produces a lot of resources that can be used by people like me, so people working with parliamentarians, with NGOs, preparing action points for others that are going to advocate in front of important institutions, international, domestic institutions. So I would definitely encourage you to look through the resources that the center prepared and continues to prepare. And I think that could definitely help as well to engage others in advocating for the persecuted Christians or persecuted religious groups in general. The topic of this lunch session is on persecution of religious minorities in the Middle East. And because of my background, because of the work that I've been doing over the last months and years, I'll be talking mostly on the case of Daesh atrocities against religious minorities in Syria and Iraq. But of course, when we talk about religious persecution, we need to remember that religious minorities are persecuted all over the world. We are not talking only about Christians that are being persecuted. Other religious groups are also persecuted for the faith. That includes, for example, Yazidis that were being persecuted by Daesh in Iraq. That includes Rohingya Muslims persecuted in Burma, which is, of course, a very recent, not necessarily recent case. It's nothing new, but over the last months, of course, the case got more and more attention, mostly because of the severity of the persecution encountered by Rohingya Muslims. And of course, then we have many other religious groups, and we cannot forget about them. The issue of religious persecution is a global concern. And having said that, lots of research conducted by NGOs, academic researchers, concludes that Christianity is the most persecuted religious group in the world. And this research was presented, for example, by Civitas UK, Open Doors, Aid to the Church in Need. David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of the UK, also named Christians as the most persecuted group in the world. Similarly, Angela Merkel made the same conclusion, reviewing research conducted by various groups. But if we look at the case of Daesh atrocities against religious groups, not only Christians, we see that this persecution has reached a totally different level. We are not talking about single incidents of violence anymore. We are talking about systematic mistreatment, abuse, murder, sexual violence, enforced disappearance, forced conversion, and many other atrocities. And in the case of Daesh, we are talking about atrocities that were perpetrated with the aim to destroy religious pluralism in the region. That's the reason when we talk about the case of Daesh, we need to think about several religious minorities that were being persecuted. Of course, that includes Christian minorities in the Middle East, that includes Yazidis, Shia Muslims, and many others. So what happened in the case of Daesh atrocities? Around 2014, Daesh, a terrorist group with international support of over 30,000 of foreign fighters, they started establishing a caliphate in many regions of Syria and Iraq. In Syria, of course, they abused the fact that Syria was in the middle of a Syrian civil war. The country was unstable, so of course it was easier, or it was an easy target for Daesh. In Iraq, the situation was slightly different. Iraq was very fragile back in 2014, and Iraq has been fragile ever since approximately 2003. Or many Christians that I interviewed in Iraq, they mentioned 2003 as the time when their fate has changed. And of course, 2003, that was when Saddam Hussein was removed from power. And it is very strange to talk about the removal of power, the removal of Saddam Hussein as the time when Christians started becoming persecuted or discriminated against by others. But it has to be emphasized that Saddam Hussein was a very strong leader and had also Christian advisors, and that helped religious minorities, and especially Christians, to have decent life under his reign. Unfortunately, afterwards, when he was gone, there was nobody who would be the strong leader in the region, and that also resulted in many Christians becoming targeted by others. That includes individuals or groups, and of course that also helped groups like Daesh to actually come to the region or establish stronger groups that would conduct various acts of violence. And as already mentioned, in 2014 is a very important year for in this region, because of course that's when the caliphate was established. So that's when Daesh took control over several regions of Iraq as well as Syria. And a very important date in lives of especially Yazidis was the 3rd of August 2014. This is when Daesh came to Sinjar. On 3rd of August 2014, Yazidis were left unprotected in Sinjar. Initially, Peshmerga fighters were there to protect them. They were meant to stay with them and protect them from Daesh, because people knew that Daesh was coming to the region. Unfortunately, Peshmerga fighters left Yazidis unprotected, and this is also why Yazidis were a very easy target for Daesh. Many women and girls were then abducted by Daesh, and then subjected to sexual slavery, sexual abuse. Many boys were kidnapped by Daesh as well, and basically to become child soldiers and fight together with Daesh fighters. And many men were killed. And if you follow some of the news coming from Iraq, mass graves continue to be discovered in Iraq. Just recently, there was a new mass grave discovered of over 60 Yazidi men. Just a few days ago, there was another mass grave discovered with approximately 40 Christians. So more and more information is coming from that region, and we are discovering more and more atrocities perpetrated by Daesh. And of course, there were some people who managed to escape Sinjar, and they escaped to Mount Sinjar. And they were there for several days without water, without food. Many people died because of starvation, dehydration. And this is also when the US government reacted to the atrocities and sent some water, food to ensure that the Yazidis that managed to escape Sinjar will survive. Just a few days after the attack in Sinjar, Daesh then decided to attack Nineveh Plains. Nineveh Plains is a region that was mostly populated by Christians. And when Daesh attacked, many Christians started to flee the region. After the attack on Sinjar, it was known that you have to take any warnings that Daesh is coming very seriously. And people knew exactly what can happen. They knew exactly what happened to Yazidis, so they took it very seriously and decided to flee the region. And they were fleeing overnight, not taking anything with them, leaving everything behind, and just fleeing to Kurdistan. And overnight, for example, from Karakosh, over 60,000 people fled to Kurdistan. From the whole region, approximately 120,000 of Christians had to flee that night. And of course, they fled to Kurdistan, and Kurdistan was one of the places that actually Daesh was not able to conquer. And that's, again, also thanks to US intervention, because US Army helped to protect Kurdistan from Daesh. However, of course, once they fled the region, they ended in Kurdistan. They had to stay on the streets, in churches. There was no place for them to go. Kurdistan was not prepared for the influx of so many thousands of Christians fleeing the region. So, in summary, that's one of the worst days that Christians and Yazidis had to face in August 2014. But of course, it didn't stop there. Once they left their homes, of course, they were hopeful that they would be able to return to their homes after a few days. Unfortunately, that was not possible. The region was still under Daesh for many months after August 2014. And during Daesh reign over the region, of course, they did not only steal all the belongings of Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities. They destroyed all churches, they destroyed all signs of, for example, Christianity in the region. I managed to go to the Nineveh Plains just 2-3 weeks after liberation of Karakosh, Bartella, Karamles. And I visited several churches, and you could really see that Daesh wanted to destroy any kind of sign of Christianity that was there. They burned all Bibles, any kinds of prayer books. They broke crosses, they destroyed rosaries as well. So basically to ensure that there is no sign of Christianity. And as already mentioned, they wanted to destroy the religious pluralism in the region. So that was one way of doing that. It was not enough for them to force others to flee. They wanted to ensure that there is no sign of Christians there. And what was also visible when I went to Iraq was also that they destroyed all houses that were there. Of course, there were different levels of destruction, and just recently there was a survey conducted by Nineveh Plains Reconstruction Committee, and they assessed that over 13,000 houses were destroyed by Daesh with a different level of destruction, and they started preparing what houses they can actually rebuild. And that's basically to ensure that the area is habitable in the future. And just looking at the atrocities, I already mentioned some of the acts perpetrated by Daesh. They intend to destroy religious pluralism. Another element that is very visible in the acts perpetrated by Daesh is the specific intent to destroy the groups in Hulo Impat. This was definitely visible in the case of Yazidis. Many of them were killed or abducted. Many of them forcibly removed from the region as well. So, for example, approximately 3,000 of Yazidi girls and women were actually transported to Syria, the region of Syria. And they're still there, and they've been there for the last 4 years, and nobody knows what's happening to them. This specific intent is also visible in the case of Christians. It's slightly different than, for example, in the case of the Yazidis, because many Christians managed to escape the region. So many of them didn't face Daesh directly. But this specific intent is, for example, visible in the online propaganda. They produce a newsletter called Dabik, and one of the newsletters is actually all about Christians, with the promise to break the cross, to conquer Rome, to enslave Christian women. So the specific intent is there. And because of the acts perpetrated by Daesh, and because of the specific intent to destroy the groups in Hulon and Pad, several domestic and international actors recognize the atrocities perpetrated by Daesh as genocide. So we have such recognition from the European Parliament, we have it from the Council of Europe, from the US State Department, Congress as well, parliaments in the UK, Austria, Italy, France, Hungary, and many more. And what this recognition should mean is that the victims should receive rapid assistance, that, of course, the atrocities should be stopped, and the perpetrators should be brought to justice. And some of the steps have been taken over the last years. Nonetheless, the steps are very slow, they are very small. So one of the steps that have been taken and was successful was a military step. So we could see a coalition of different countries that came together to fight against Daesh. And the coalition is called Coalition Against Daesh. And of course, US was involved there, UK, and many more. And they worked together to ensure that Daesh fighters are stopped and they don't take control over more regions, and try to, of course, ensure that they don't only expand, but the territories shrink. And at the end of last year, Iraqi government informed that the fight against Daesh is over in Iraq. Unfortunately, Daesh is still present, for example, in Syria, in Egypt, and in other regions. There are also groups that pledged alliance with Daesh, including Boko Haram in Nigeria. So unfortunately, the influence of Daesh is still there, and it will take years to continue this fight against Daesh. But nonetheless, some of the major successes have been already achieved. But of course, apart from military steps, there are other steps that have been taken and need to be taken in the future as well. So another step that I would like to discuss is the humanitarian assistance. Many persecuted religious groups, they have been provided with assistance, for example, by the UNHCR. Many Christian groups have been provided by assistance from churches or NGOs. But unfortunately, many groups continue to be forgotten. So I visited an internally displaced persons camp in Iraq, and unfortunately, the UNHCR assistance was not reaching them. So they relied only on assistance from churches and NGOs. I met also refugees, Iraqi Christian refugees in Jordan. And again, they did not receive the assistance that they needed. They relied on very limited assistance from churches and NGOs. So it's a massive question mark. And there was a great response from the US government. After hearing the voices from the field, after getting to know that the assistance is not reaching them, Vice President Pence promised to redirect the financial assistance and ensure that the persecuted religious groups groups persecuted by Daesh are assisted. And hopefully we'll see the first results of this promise over the next months. But unfortunately, other countries still are not looking into what's happening to the financial assistance that the groups should be provided with. So, for example, in the UK, millions and millions of taxpayer money is going to, for example, Iraq, to fund 171 projects that's supposed to assist Iraqi Christians and 80 projects that's supposed to assist Yazidi minorities over there. Unfortunately, we know from NGOs work in the field that this money does not arrive there, but we don't know what's happening to the money, and the UK government is still not looking into it. It's not investigating or overseeing what's happening to the projects that's supposed to be funded over there. So the humanitarian assistance is ongoing. Of course, there are some failings in this step. Nonetheless, we need to put more pressure, for example, on governments or other international organizations to ensure that the victims of Daesh atrocities are helped. And the next step that I would like to talk about is about legal challenges or legal issues that need to be addressed. And as already mentioned, one of the steps that needs to be taken is to bring the perpetrators to justice. It is not enough to stop the perpetrators. It is not enough to help the victims and give them food, water, medical assistance. It is important to ensure that victims can see that justice is being done, that the perpetrators are brought to justice, and hopefully that will also prevent any future similar atrocities from occurring. So over the last months, I've been working, for example, with the Council of Europe to present different options how Daesh fighters could be brought to justice, whether that could be an international tribunal or, for example, the International Criminal Court could deal with the prosecutions, or maybe that could be some kind of a more regional tribunal. And one of the big steps that was taken was when the UK government started working with the Iraqi government, and they tabled a resolution at the UN Security Council to establish an investigative team to collect, preserve, and prepare the evidence of the Daesh atrocities perpetrated in Iraq for future prosecutions. Of course, the resolution was adopted just a few months ago, so we still don't see the results of this step being taken by the UN Security Council, but nonetheless, this is the first step towards justice. So the evidence needs to be obtained and preserved. As already mentioned, some of the evidence continues to be discovered. For example, there are more and more mass graves being discovered in the Nineveh Plains region, in the Sinjar region. So, of course, this is the evidence that is needed to ensure that Daesh fighters will be brought to justice. But it's still a long way to go. And, of course, once the evidence is preserved, or even before that, we need to start thinking, what is the best tribunal to prosecute Daesh fighters? Is it one of the Iraqi courts? Or maybe we need more international response. At the end of the day, thousands of the Daesh fighters are actually from all over the world. According to Southern Group report, approximately 150 to 150 of the foreign fighters are actually from the US. It is not a big number, believe me. Just from Europe, we had 5,700 foreign fighters from Europe. Only from the UK, between 850, 900 foreign fighters. So, of course, it shows that the problem is really international, and we cannot only focus on domestic investigations or domestic prosecutions in Iraq. It is truly one of the worst international atrocities over the last years. And that's the reason international response is really needed. But, of course, it is one thing to ensure that the prosecutions of Daesh fighters, whether in Iraq or in the region, or more internationally. But we cannot forget that many countries, and especially countries whose citizens went to Syria and Iraq, to fight together with Daesh, those countries also have an obligation to prosecute, to investigate the crimes and prosecute them on the national domestic level. So, for example, the UK should prosecute the Daesh fighter returnees. And we know that approximately 450 of the Daesh fighters that are from the UK, they already returned back to the UK. But we don't see the prosecutions happening. We know only about approximately 101 convictions, but what is happening to the rest? We know exactly what one person can do if they conduct any kind of atrocities in the UK or other places. The UK has been subjected to so many terrorist attacks last year and over the years as well, and other parts of Europe as well. So we need to make sure that we really address the issue at national, international, and international level as well. But of course, bringing Daesh to justice, that is not the only legal step that we need to take. Another step that we need to take is to ensure that religious minorities in Iraq or in Syria or other countries that are adequately protected. That, for example, involves ensuring that their rights are adequately protected. So, for example, if we look at the constitution, we need to ensure that the rights of Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities have some constitutional protections equally with other group, and of course the majority group. And but once the rights are protected on the paper, of course that's also not enough. We need to ensure that the rights are adequately enforced, and that if a person was abused or persecuted by somebody else, this case is duly investigated and the perpetrator is brought to justice. And we can definitely not leave it to the situation that the persecution continues and reaches such level as we saw with Daesh atrocities, so reaching the level of genocide. So the actions have to follow at an early stage rather than leaving it until it's too late to address the situation adequately. And in the case of Daesh, of course, we are talking about atrocities perpetrated by a terrorist group. That's the reason some of the steps that were taken to address the situation, politically or diplomatically, they were a little bit easier because, again, we are talking about terrorist organization. But when we talk about religious persecution or persecution of minority groups in general, the persecution doesn't have to come from other groups or terrorist groups or non-state actors. Sometimes this persecution is perpetrated by the state and state actors. And of course, that's when it gets a little bit more difficult to introduce any kinds of military, legal, or other steps. And despite the fact that my presentation is about the Middle East, I would like to mention one case that is outside of the Middle East, but portrays the problem with cases when the persecution is perpetrated by state actors. And this is the case of the Rohingya Muslims in Burma. In this case, of course, we are talking about violence, similar violence as perpetrated by Daesh. We are talking about forced displacement, abuse, torture. There were also cases of sexual violence and many others. However, this violence is not perpetrated by a terrorist group, as in the case of Daesh. It's authorized by the state, or at least that's the allegation. One of the problems is that, for example, UN investigators are not allowed into the country, so they cannot conduct the investigations and univocally identify the perpetrators. There was one report prepared by the UN last year, and that report was based on interviews with victims that were already in Bangladesh. So basically, that was a way for the UN to investigate the atrocities perpetrated against the Rohingya Muslims without being allowed into the country. And based on the investigations, based on the interviews, they concluded that the atrocities may amount to crimes against humanity. There's a possibility of genocide as well, and of course, actions have to be taken. Unfortunately, because it is a state actor that authorizes the atrocities, the steps that are taken by the international community are different. So, for example, now, most of the steps that have been taken, they are just diplomatic dialogue, political dialogue with, between the UN or other states with the Burmese government, which is, of course, not enough. And Rohingya Muslims continue to be persecuted. They continue to flee the region. They continue to flee to Bangladesh, trying to find a safety. And so just looking at those two different cases, we see that religious persecution, well, could happen anywhere in the world, but depending really on the perpetrator, the response will differ as well. And the question is, of course, whether there's anything we can do. And I know that many of us feel very small thinking about mass atrocities amounting to genocide that happen on the other side of the world, far, far away from us. And of course, I think it is a good question what any one of us can do. And for example, one of the main things that I normally tell others that they can do is to contact your representatives, ask questions, what is being done at the regional or national level to help persecuted groups. So for example, what is being done to help Iraqi Christians by the US government or UN, and how, for example, the US is involved at the UN to ensure that the UN is really looking into those cases of religious persecution or persecution in general. And for example, one of great steps that was taken also by one of US representatives, and that's Chris Smith, was to table a very important bill that would allow to send funds to help persecuted minorities, and mostly minorities persecuted by Daesh. Unfortunately, this bill didn't go anywhere, so it continues to be at a very low level of debates, and there is no guarantee that it's going to proceed any further. But in such case, it would be great as well to put more pressure on and engage in debates with representatives to ensure that, for example, this bill is reconsidered and it proceeds so that the victims can actually benefit from some kind of assistance. And as already mentioned, there is still a massive gap that needs to be filled, and many victims don't have access to humanitarian assistance, whether food, shelter, or medical assistance that is also greatly needed. Another option would be, for example, to engage your communities, to engage your churches as well. Many churches that I had a chance to meet, they are, for example, collecting items that can be sent to Iraq or Syria and to help religious minorities over there. It doesn't seem to be very easy because, of course, you would have to somehow deliver it to the people over there. But nonetheless, there are many organizations that work in the field. There are organizations like Aid to the Church in Need. They, for example, fund lots of different projects in Iraq. One of the projects that they work together with the Nineveh Plains Reconstruction Committee that I already mentioned, and they provide funds to rebuild different homes. And last time I had a meeting with them, which was in November last year, they managed to rebuild over 1,000 of homes in one of the biggest towns in Nineveh Plains called Karakosh. And they were working on another 600. And of course, once a home is rebuilt, they give it back to the rightful owner. So if they manage to rebuild the homes, that will also encourage people to return to their homes. And it's not as easy as it sounds, because even if you are able to go back to your home, there is still a security concern. There's also a concern whether anything similar is going to happen in the near future. And the question of security is definitely still of a great concern, and it's not being adequately addressed. And again, as already mentioned, another issue is to ensure that the rights of the victims are, the rights of the people who are there, adequately protected. But this is also not being looked into. And this is also why it is important to start thinking about the future of religious minorities in the region. What needs to be done to ensure that they can not only return, but that they can be safe in their homes. And yes, and another way of how we could get involved is to help some of NGOs working in the field, advocate on their behalf, inform others. Because, for example, the case of Christian Yazidi minorities in Iraq continues to disappear from the public square, continues to disappear from the media. Media is not reporting about the situation of Iraqi minorities anymore. Right now, one of the main topics is Rohingya Muslims' persecution. And of course, the case requires a lot of attention. However, we cannot forget that the mere fact that Daesh is not in Iraq anymore, it doesn't mean that the victims and the survivors, they don't need our help, they don't need our support, advocacy, and so we just need to ensure that the topic continues to be remembered, continues to be advocated at domestic, international levels. I think I will conclude here, but of course, if there are any questions, I will be very happy to answer the questions.
Thank you. Thank you to Ewelina. We have some time for questions, and we have 2 mics here, so please just raise your hand and introduce yourself too before you.
Very much. I'm Jean DeFazio, and I really thank you for sharing what you did. I attended a seminary in the north of England in 2004 with Iranian Christians who converted from Islam. Several testimonies of execution. I'm wondering if you include anything about the problem of persecution in Iran of Christians?
Sure. Yes, I've been researching a little bit the situation in Iran as well, and the situation is, of course, bad, and it's mostly state-authorized persecution, but also there is sectarian violence and many more. The topic of persecution of Christian minorities in Iran has not gained much attention, or as much attention as other cases. But just recently there was a very interesting case at the European Court of Human Rights, and that was of a Muslim convert to Christianity who escaped Iran and who, because of fear for his life, he wanted to stay in Switzerland, and unfortunately his asylum application in Switzerland was rejected, and there was a possibility that he would be deported back to Iran. And of course, he feared that once he goes back to Iran, he will be persecuted. And this case, unfortunately, was unsuccessful at the European Court of Human Rights. The decision of the court was that an assessment made by the Swiss authorities was correct, and the assessment of the Swiss authorities was that if he returns back to Iran, he would be able to practice his faith discreetly. So, of course, then the question is, what does it mean to practice your faith discreetly? Does it mean you can practice your faith behind closed doors? Can you wear a cross in the public? Can you tell anyone that you are Christian? Or is it already too much? So, of course, unfortunately, this judgment was definitely very negative for the topic of religious persecution and the case of Muslim converts to Christianity in Iran, because it neglects the fact that they cannot practice the faith in Iran. And statements like, you can practice your faith discreetly, I think it neglects the issue of religious persecution, and I was very disappointed with the judgment in general. And I think that converts to Christianity in Iran, they definitely need more attention, and cases like the one that was in front of the European Court of Human Rights, they should never be decided as they were. It's just, I think, more attention needs to be placed on ensuring that the evidence of such persecution reaches the right people as well. So there are several reports out there explaining the severity of the issue, but I think those reports are not reaching the right people as well. So, for example, it's not enough that they reach the UN, but such reports could be also submitted to the European Court of Human Rights whenever such case is in front of the court. In this case, there was only one report that was submitted to explain the issue of persecution of Muslim converts to Christianity in Iran, and that was not enough. So it's important to engage NGOs, to engage researchers who are working on the topic, to ensure that their sources are being used by many different actors. At the domestic level, that's one step, definitely. But to engage also UN, European Parliament, Council of Europe, and many others to ensure that the right evidence reaches the right people to basically change the situation. Okay.
Any other questions?
I'm Ed Kazarian. I'm a faculty member here. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate this very much. My own experience in this is that I am a grandchild of the Armenian genocide, and so I'm very much interested. I have a question for you. Have you done any research or seen any evidence of either a Christian state or a Christian subgroup of some sort that is guilty of this kind of atrocity toward others?
I personally have not done any such research. I've been looking mostly on the most recent cases of genocidal atrocities or religious persecution, and that basically was mostly in relation to Daesh atrocities in the Middle East, Boko Haram atrocities against religious minorities over there. I've looked also into Fulani herdsmen in Nigeria, then religious persecution in Pakistan, in North Africa, and many more. Unfortunately, I don't know, of course, all cases. I started this work approximately 3 years ago, and I had hands full with the cases that I've been working on. But of course, I understand that there may be cases where, for example, other religious groups are persecuted by Christians, but of course that has to be considered case by case. And I would be very happy to review any situation to consider whether, for example, mass atrocities like genocide, crimes against humanity, or other atrocities are perpetrated. And of course, as already mentioned at the beginning, religious persecution can happen to any religious group. Unfortunately, normally it happens that it is minority religion in a country that is being persecuted for the faith. But there are also cases that do not reach the level of persecution, but they, for example, amount to discrimination. And we cannot forget about them, but we also have to separate both, because religious discrimination is definitely more common than religious persecution. And of course, religious discrimination also requires attention and needs to be addressed. But any kind of atrocities or acts of discrimination, they have to be investigated, and steps have to be taken to ensure that people can live in accordance with the faith. And because that's the basic of, that's the fundamental right of everyone. So it's not only in our constitutions that we have this right, freedom of religion or belief, but it's also protected internationally. So if a country is in breach of that right, then of course it is important to ensure that some international actors are aware of it, to investigate it, and to initially send some recommendation to the state. But if that doesn't work, then of course there are other steps that can be taken to ensure that the right to freedom of religion belief is adequately protected. But it's a right of everyone.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering if you had any research on like Christians in Afghanistan.
Once again, sorry?
I was just wondering if you had any research on Christians in Afghanistan.
I have not worked on the case of Christians in Afghanistan yet. It's definitely a case that I want to look into, and I hope to be able to tell you a little bit more maybe later this year, but that's on my list as well. There's a few cases that I'm very interested in and I would like to review over the next months, and that's definitely Christians in Afghanistan. I would like to look into the situation in a number of African countries as well, including South Sudan, including Kenya as well, and a few more, Congo. So it's a matter of time. But definitely I look forward to looking at the situation of Christian and other religious minorities in different parts of the world.
Hi, my name is John Brandkamp. I work for the school. Again, like others have said, thank you so much for your presentation. I was curious on a more linguistic level. Internationally, you used it, and it's the more common term for the group in Syria and Iraq is Daesh. But here in the U.S., we typically call them either ISIS or ISIL.
Sure.
And I'd be curious as to if you could explain why the difference in the nomenclature is so important.
Okay. Well, I normally use I use the word Daesh, which is the Arabic for Islamic State. I don't think it's important to pick one of them. In the US, Daesh is called ISIS. At the UN, it's ISIL. In the UK, it's Daesh. So each country is using a different name for Daesh. I personally don't believe that should be our main focus. The main focus is to recognize the severity of the atrocities and to act to counter those atrocities, to stop them and to prosecute the perpetrators. But I understand that different countries use different name for Daesh.
Hi, I asked this question because I read some books study about Africa saying a lot of times we think a dictator is very bad in a Western society, but sometimes from the regional view, sometimes, like you mentioned, Saddam Hussein, he was a dictator, but he somehow maintained the stability. So as a human rights advocate, how would you see this problem, or how would you suggest the UN or other, the Western society to see reasonably, or to see in this case how to balance?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult question, and I had a similar concerns about the case of Syria. So of course the president is allegedly committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, maybe also atrocities amounting to genocide. So of course he's being perceived as the dictator, and the question from the international law perspective, of course, if he is guilty, if he committed those crimes, he should be prosecuted for the atrocities. But on the other side, I remember speaking to some of Syrian Christians, and basically they were very concerned about removing him from power. And they were worried that once he's gone, a similar situation will happen as it happened to Iraqi Christians in Iraq. So it's a massive concern. And the question is whether to keep him in power and so protect religious minorities like Christians, or maybe there are other options that should be considered, that should be explored. And of course, the situation in Syria is very complicated. There are so many different actors that are involved in the atrocities. And I think the pressure from a number of Western countries is to remove him from power and then deal with the situation, somehow protect religious minorities, as for example, Christians. I don't know what is the right answer for now. I think if he committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, he should be brought to justice. That's very clear from the international law perspective. But at the same time, I would like to ensure that, for example, religious minorities as Christians are adequately protected. And I think that should be a priority. Once we go further with trying to stop the atrocities there. What is the right option? I'm not sure, but the fate of victims and survivors is really important, and we should put them first. That should be the main focus of whatever steps we take.
My name's Joe Kendrick. I'm wondering if you have any information about actions that have been taken against Daesh atrocities by Muslim nations that aren't sympathetic, perhaps the Gulf nations or others?
Generally. Well, my main focus is to look, for example, what the UN is doing to counter Daesh. I've been working also with mostly European nations or European governments or parliamentarians on the topic. So I personally never work with any Muslim nations in relation to that, mostly because I live in Europe and it's easier to cooperate with local partners. So unfortunately, I'm not sure what exactly has been is being done to address the issue. But for example, of course, Daesh has been active in a number of Muslim countries, especially, for example, in North Africa, including Egypt, Algeria, as long as I remember, Libya. And of course, there have been a number of counter-terrorism activities that were basically authorized by the governments to ensure that that the Daesh does not constitute a threat to local people over there. So that's definitely ongoing, and a number of Muslim countries are also within the coalition against Daesh. I can't name them, but I can definitely give you also details of the coalition where you can find more information about it. But I think many countries recognize that Daesh is not only a problem to, for example, Syria and Iraq, and also the presence of Daesh fighters in other countries is being taken seriously. But of course, we are talking about a massive issue, international issue, and I think, generally speaking, all countries responded to the problem a little bit late. That's the reason it has reached the level of atrocities as we've been witnessing over the years. So it's a very difficult issue to address. But I would not say that it's more difficult in other countries, Muslim countries, than in, for example, countries like the UK. As I mentioned, from the UK, there were approximately 900 foreign fighters that left the UK, left their homes, families, everything what they had, and they moved to Syria and Iraq to fight with Daesh. So, of course, that suggests a massive issue of radicalization in countries like the UK. And this needs to be addressed, but how do you address radicalization? This is a massive concern, and the UK government has been looking into the situation in the UK over the last months and years, tried to introduce new policies, new strategies. For example, there is a new strategy from 2015 to counter extremism, not terrorism anymore, extremism, because just to recognize that terrorism is not the only issue. We need to look even earlier than once the atrocities or once the terrorist acts are already committed. And one of the responses was that extremism is the issue that we need to start addressing. But again, how do you define extremism? And the response of the UK government is very unconventional, and I can discuss it later on as well. But it's a massive issue for all countries, the issue of terrorism in general, but then again of Daesh atrocities, and so it's a difficult issue to address.
We have time for one more question. issues. Anyone who wants to take the last one?
Dr. Kazarian, my colleague, asked about Christians persecuting non-Christians. In the Balkans, in the region where I come from, we had the Serbian Orthodox and then later also Croatian Catholics commit atrocities against Bosniak Muslims. The famous case of Srebrenica, where some 7,000 to 8,000 Muslim men were slaughtered.
Yes.
Which was the worst since the Second World War in Europe.
Yes.
So Christians are not without guilt here. And I think all of you study church histories. Ever since the Constantinian reversal, where persecuted church became privileged church and then powerful church, they persecuted minorities to different degree in different areas and different times, but also persecuting minorities within the Christendom. So, this country came into existence in some ways because Christians who were persecuted by European Christendom nations fled for freedom. And that's why you have, and I'm simplifying it for the sake of the time, that's why you have the only country with a consistent church and state separation in this country. Because organized Christianity, where the Pope and the Tsar, or in Russia you have the case of Russia today, because Putin and Patriarch work closely together, and it's not always to the benefit of the minorities, to put it euphemistically. But thank you for your presentation and wonderful handling of questions.
Yes, I would just maybe also just mention a few issues. Of course, Srebrenica is another case of genocide, is widely recognized as genocide as well. And it's an important example to show that anyone can be persecuted for religion. And in this case, of course, that was against Muslim groups. I've done a bit of research in relation to genocidal atrocities in Bosnia, and Srebrenica was always a case that I would always remember on the anniversary, and I've written a little bit about the atrocities as well. And this is also another case that shows that, for example, even countries that were meant to protect people in the region, and they were there, for example, like the Dutch army, they can also fail people that they were meant to protect. Similarly, as I explained the case of Yazidis that were left by Peshmerga fighters, a similar situation happened in Srebrenica when the Dutch armies, they were not able to protect people that were meant to protect in the first place. They were there for this particular, this reason. So it's a definitely important case to learn many things from. Unfortunately, we haven't learned much from that case. Another case that you mentioned was Russia. Russia is a very interesting case in relation to freedom of religion belief. And I just wanted to mention a new law that was adopted just recently, is law preventing missionary activity. So it's not like you can go to Russia and become as a missionary. You can't really go there. You have to register, and with certain religions, it's also very likely that you are not going to get the registration. And if you don't have registration, if you are preach without any kind of registration, if you are distributing any religious materials without permission, you can end up in jail. So that's what's happened to a number of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia as well. So of course, it's a different level of discrimination, maybe persecution. I think that will have to be looked and assessed a little bit closer as well. But nonetheless, that's another issue that religious groups are dealing with in countries like Russia, and there are many other countries where religious groups are being discriminated against or are prevented from manifesting their religious belief. And I think all such cases should be assessed, they should be considered, because it never, like in the case of Daesh atrocities, it never starts with genocide. It is not peace and peaceful manifestation of religion belief and then genocide. It's a step-by-step until it reaches the level of crimes against humanity, genocide. But it never happens overnight. So ideally, we should act when we see the first red flags of mass atrocities, without waiting till it's too late to prevent the atrocities or to prevent genocide from occurring. I would just mention even the Convention on Genocide from 1948. It is not only to act when genocide occurs. We have a duty to prevent genocide from occurring. And we can't prevent genocide if it already happened. So we need to recognize the signs of genocidal atrocities and act as soon as possible. And I would definitely recommend an article by Gregory Stanton, professor at one of the US universities, I think George Mason University. And that's about 10 stages of genocide. And that basically explains how genocide is being perpetrated, how people basically try to engage others and show that this one group is not like us and doesn't deserve legal protections and many more. So I think just recognize those different stages of mass atrocities as genocide is crucial to prevent mass atrocities and genocide from occurring.